Howdy and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the post-race reaction for the Miami GP. What was your thoughts on the Miami GP? I know I had a lot more passing than I was expecting due to that new tarmac, and seeing those free practice sessions and that qualifying session kind of draw that one racing line throughout the track. It seemed like if you got off that line, it was fairly slick, so I was expecting a lot more, nose to tail running in this race than I actually saw, but still, for some reason, I did not seem to have the oomph that I was really wanting or expecting to have in this Miami GP. I'll give it a 7 out of 10 as it had fairly good intermix in that midfield, and it didn't hurt that Max Verstappen was coming from that midfield up to the front of the field for this race. So overall, I'll give it a 7 out of 10. What was your rating for this Miami GP? We'll start from the back of the field and work my way up normally, as like I normally do. So we'll start off in 20th position with Logan Sargent. He kind of had some issues early on, knocking that front wing, making him come in for that pit stop. And he was trying off a different strategy, but it didn't help, and that front wing got damaged and turned in. So he basically came in early and stayed there for the rest of the grid. Oscar Piastri was basically the same way. He had gained a couple positions on that start of the race, but due to that damage that he had on that vehicle, he had to come in early on and get earlier pit stop than they were wanting to, putting him right ahead of Logan Sargent. So he basically stayed at that same position. Nick DeVries started off in 15th and ended up 18th. I don't have a whole lot for him, except for the fact that he had lost 5 positions on that start of the race. Didn't look like a very good race for Nick. Hopefully he can start matching his teammate Yuki in the coming races. Lando kind of had that wrong strategy, kind of ran a little bit harder than he was wanting to on those tires and just couldn't hang on as much. He started off in 16th and went to 17th. He was one of the ones that actually started off on softs, which didn't really work out, and had to switch over to the hards early on. Guan Yu Zhou started off in 14th, where he qualified and ended up 16th. He lost 2 positions on the start of the race and basically stayed there for the rest of the race. Nico qualified in 12th and ended up in 16th. I have Nico having gained 1 position on the start of the race, starting off on those hard tires and trying to go long and boxing a lap 34 for those mediums, which kind of pushed him back into that mid-pack, where he was able not to really recover and pass those midfields to get back into those positions. He kind of got stuck in that line, wearing down, so he didn't actually make it to where he probably should have been if they had a little bit different strategy for him. Albon qualified 11th and ended up 14th. I know he had voiced his displeasure with their strategy that he was on during the race. I know he lost 1 position during that start, but didn't really make it up, possibly due to the strategy, possibly due to that Williams. Valtteri started off in 10th and ended up 13th. I thought he was going to do a lot better job than he ended up doing after seeing that 10th qualifying position. He did gain 2 spots on the start of the race, but couldn't hang on to those throughout this sector on that Alfa Romeo, so he ended up dropping back down in the grid. Lance Stroll, on the other hand, qualified 18th and ended up working his way all the way back up to 12th. He did gain 1 position on the start of the race. He did start off on the hard tires and switch to the mediums. So he went a little bit longer stint than the rest of them on the first stint due to those hard tires instead of the mediums. He did pass Albon on lap 49 for 13th and then worked his way all the way up to 12th from Bottas. So good job for Lance in that run, not quite getting into those points. Yuki's another one that did a really good job coming in from 17th all the way to 11th, just outside the points. That's like several times that Yuki has ended up in that 11th position, just outside the point range. I think he's doing a really good job in that AlphaTauri, which doesn't seem to be a very good car this year. But he did take 2 positions on the start of the race, and he did pass Bottas for that 11th position on lap 51. Kind of working his way through, doing a good job for him. Kevin Magnussen dropped down from 4th after that crazy qualifying session and ended up in the points, thankfully for him, in that 10th position. He kind of battled it out with Charles Leclerc, actually, in part of this race, which was kind of interesting to see that sister race of Haas fight the main Ferrari championship, cars going at each other for pretty much the same kind of vehicle with those Ferraris parts. And Kevin really getting his elbows out and really doing a good fight for that position, but ended up back into 4th. Ocon was one of these that started off on the hard tires and went long and ended up dropping back into 9th position, but I think he did a fairly good job keeping that different strategy alive and working for him. Pierre Gasly, his teammate, was a little bit ahead of him, starting off in 5th and ended up just ahead of him at the end of the race in 8th. He gained a position on the start of the race and was able to pass Stroll on lap 26 for that 10th position, and then kind of worked his way back up to that 8th position due to some of those front runners running that alternate strategy as well. Charles Leclerc kind of ended up in the same position he qualified in. He kind of took it and then got stuck in that line of cars and really couldn't do anything with it. He kind of got himself in a position with that Ferrari which he really couldn't have the advantages that he needed to work his way back up from that midfield cars up into that front runner section. So unfortunately for him, he kind of ended up where he was. He did have that nice battle back and forth with K-Mag, which probably didn't help his race at all, but it was kind of nice to see those Ferraris battling it out. Lewis qualified 13th and ended up in 6th. He was complaining early on about his strategy, but it ended up paying off for him as he was able to get back up into that 6th position from that 13th, whereas his teammate was on a slightly different strategy, so he's just slightly ahead of him. Carlos Sainz started off in 3rd and ended up back in 5th. He was having some trouble in that race, but was able to hang on to that 5th position, even though he had a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane, as he was getting tired of getting stuck behind people and got pulled into that pit a little bit later than he probably wanted to get called into. So he kind of hit the brakes a little bit harder and didn't quite get down to that speed limit for that pit lane. George Russell qualified 6th and ended up in 4th. He had a really good battle. He, during this race, he had gained one position on the start of the race. He had fight with Gasly. He had to fight with, a couple other folks, working their way up through this with Ocon and Sainz into that 4th position. So I think he did a really good job in that run. Fernando, even though he's red here, because he qualified 2nd and dropped down to 3rd, I think he did all he could in that Aston Martin. Those Red Bulls were way far speedier than that Aston Martin, as we saw with Sergio and Max working his way back up through that field. So he had a kind of a lonely race ahead of George Russell in that 4th position, but too far behind that 2nd position to really put any pressure on Sergio Perez at all. So he kind of had a lonely race. In fact, he actually saw in the big screen where his teammate Stroll was actually passing and was commenting on the radio about that. So he was able to do multiple things during that race, which was interesting. Sergio, I think, did a fairly good job, even though he dropped down from 1st to that 2nd position. He was able to keep the lead from Alonso on the start of the race, got out ahead of him, broke that, the DRS limit, was able to maintain that spot because of the uncertainty about those tires and how they were going to perform and how long they were going to run because of the, free practice sessions having some issues and unknown on that strategy. I think he did a good job of running on that normal strategy with the medium switching over to the hards at the end. So for him, he did a good job, even though, I mean, he did do the pit, worked his way back into that first position ahead of Max, just barely when Max pitted. But with the Max having those medium tires and the fresh set, when Sergio was on those hards, when they used, it really didn't have a chance to keep that first position very easily. So overall, I think he did a very good job. Max just did a superb job in this race, coming in from ninth up to first. He was able to work his way through that midfield fairly quickly, keeping that gap down to his teammate during that stint really low comparatively. And then, as I said, with those pit stop strategy, just even though he got behind him on that pit stop, he was able to gain the ground because of the tire difference in that section of the race. So Max did a superb job in that, working it all the way back and winning the race, gained the fastest lap on those medium tires, and of course got the driver of the day, as you would expect, coming in from ninth for him. A couple of other people were Gasly, maybe Russell or Lewis would be runners-ups for those driver of the day. Who was you vote for the driver of the day? If it wasn't for Max, I don't know. Leave those in the comments. This leads us to the driver standings. So we see that Max here still at 119 points in the lead, ahead of his teammate. We see that George Russell has overtaken Charles Leclerc for that 6th position. We see that Pierre Gasly's worked his way up to 10th. And then we see that Ocon has kind of just bumped ahead of Valtteri Bottas. And, of course, Kevin Magnussen gaining that 2nd point, so he's bumped himself ahead of Albon. And we have basically the same constructors standing as we had last week with Red Bull with 224 points. We do see the gap between Aston Martin and Mercedes shrink a little bit. And we also see that Alpine's matching what the McLarens have done now. So those are things to watch out for in the future. We have a week off, and then we have a triple header. So we get a slight break, and then we have a nice triple header to deal with. Hope you had a good time. Until then, I will see you on the grid.